Welcome back. This is Tampa Home Talk, and not only do we have an exciting topic lined up for you, but guess who is back in the house?
Adam Talley from Talley Insurance?
Nope, he's missing this week.
Oh, so that would be Leo Kane from Beryl Engineering and Inspection.
That's Leo. We missed him. He is back in the studio with us. And today we're going to talk all about Senate Bill 4D. This is the one that passed after 98 people died in the Surfside condo collapse down in Miami. And it was, 146 new laws passed? In July, it was a lot.
Yeah,
very high number.
It was a very, very large amount of bills that went into effect July 1st, and I'm still trying to get a hold on the grasp on all of them because I know several of them dealt with the industries that we are both in.
Yeah, you missed that show, actually, Leo. I'm going to have to give you the outline because we talked about that. And Florida Realtors did a really good job pulling out which bills affected our industry. So I made your little highlighting a little easier. So I'm going to give that to you to take home for your homework.
Is that
not this.
Oh, I was about to say, that's a stack of like 75 sheets of paper.
No, that's not it. Hold on. I'm going to give it to you.
Got a little scared there. I mean,
yeah,
that was larger than the number of new listings.
Here's a short and skinny version for you.
Okay.
We covered this while you were out.
Oh, and there's a huge picture on this, so it's really just less than half a page.
Yeah. Well, it's small print, but the House bills and the Senate bills affecting Florida home ownership.
So what's the difference between a House bill and a Senate bill? Does it like the bill needs to be passed by both?
I forget the order. I did not like government at all. Or civics.
We're not supposed to be political here on the show.
It's not.
You said you didn't like government.
The class.
Oh.
In school. Government or civics, it was like, ugh. I probably should have paid more attention, but I didn't.
Well, I do know there's three branches of government. There's the executive, the judicial, and the legislative.
Yes.
And they all have checks and balances over each other.
Right.
The executive assigns the executive assigns the judicial, the legislative writes the bills, and the judicial interprets the bills.
It's literally a wonder they get anything done because of the flow that it has to go to get it done.
Well, there was between that and Robert's Rules of Orders, there's a large theory out there saying that the founding fathers intended for government not to get done and for it to just be bureaucratic in nature so nothing could actually be done and everything could be handled on the state level.
It wouldn't surprise me
at all. With the advent of technology and everything else and faster communications, government found a way around it.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into this week's numbers, and then joining us probably around the second segment is Mr. George Root. If you guys remember him, he is with Stockholm Law Group. He'll be joining us by phone a little bit later this morning. He's our HOA attorney expert, and he is very, very well knowledgeable in terms of some of these changes that are coming. So before we jump into that, let's cover the market stats for the week. So we've had a little bit of a shift, Leo, since I don't know how closely you've been looking at the numbers, but our new listings have been higher every single week.
I love it.
Than our sold and our pending listings. So that means there's more opportunity for buyers, and it means the market's starting to shift.
Well, it's just the summer months, though. I expect come September, this will start to go in the other direction.
We'll see. Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely see what happens. We know student loans are going to they're going to have to start repaying them around that time. So it'll be interesting to see, what shape the market takes. I was watching a blog post this morning from the National Real Estate Post. And the interesting thing about these guys is they actually started this vlog during the housing crash. So they were originally on the mortgage side, and they started talking about like the number of banks that were imploding every day and like all these little things that go hand in hand with the housing market. And the interesting thing, they were talking about this economy slowdown, right? It's what the feds are trying to accomplish with all these rate hikes. And some of the stats that they put in there was, people couldn't eat out Grubhub as often, and they probably couldn't update their iPhone every 6 to 9 months. So that's the stuff they're cutting back on. And I think
you take a look at those.
Long way to go.
You take a look at those meal to door delivery systems. It's like you're paying twice as much for your food. It's a little ridiculous. I mean, like people talk about, I don't have enough discretionary money. It's like, what are you using it on? And maybe
Yeah.
you shouldn't be using it on that stuff.
You got to start with the bank statement. Let's see where the money's going, and then we can tell you exactly how you should spend it.
It's crazy, crazy. So new listings are at 1109
Yes.
compared to pendings at 1032 and solds at 846.
Yeah.
So we have a good chunk. So what's our inventory looking at? Are we like at a month inventory yet?
Oh,
Or
no, I think we're past that. I think we're probably, and I'll calculate this for you guys a little bit better. Of course, we get the backlog data from Florida Realtors, but I'm pretty close at pegging right around where we are without doing the math. And I would say we're about a little over 1.5 month supply of homes.
So we've had a substantial shift. I mean, that's a whole 4 weeks worth of shift where we were at a 2 weeks worth of inventory. Again, for those listeners that are just tuning in, inventory is if every house on the market sold and no new houses entered the market, how long would it take to run out of homes?
That's 1.5 months, roughly.
6 months would be a balanced market. And we were as little as 2 weeks about 3 months ago.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Well, it's probably a little longer than 2 weeks ago. It was probably like first quarter.
Okay.
We had that 2 week absorption rate. It started shifting and changing a little bit as the rates started moving up. So I would say around April, May was when we started to see a little bit of a shift. What we're seeing now, and this is interesting, sellers are getting freaked out that their house is not selling the first weekend it's on the market. And we're like, this is normal. You know, we may have a normal marketing time.
You can use open houses for the purpose of selling houses as opposed to just saying, hey, here's a new listing.
Yeah, something like that.
Wow.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's been interesting. But nevertheless, people are still buying homes. People are still selling homes. And if you got priced out of the market a while back looking to buy, it's probably a good time to re-enter because some of these financed buyers couldn't compete. They just could not compete with the cash. So it's a good time to come back in. And if and when the rates resettle back down, you can always marry the house and date the rate and just refinance it till it gets a little better.
Where are we on rates now? What's the primey at?
We are right at 6 or north of 6, depending on the scenario, right? Depending on how much down, what's the buyer's credit score, all this sort of stuff.
So we're actually large enough now where this recession that they say is coming, they can actually fight it through lowering rates.
Yeah, they could. Yep.
Seems a little ridiculous if they
Raise it to slow the train down. And
No, they raise it to prepare for a recession, then instantly lower it again. I think some people are up in the why rates exist are confused as to why they're doing what they're doing.
Well, I'm excited about the higher rates, and people that are savers are a little bit excited about the higher rates because you historically should be rewarding people that save money. But when we saw
Not in this country.
When we saw
Not in
things
this
like,
country.
That's how it used to be.
When? Never. Our
country.
country is based on consumerism.
I will not dispute that at all.
No, it is. We rate the health of the nation based on the gross domestic product, the gross national product, and that's spending.
Sadly, you are right. Sadly, you're right.
But
But listen, you've got to be able to have more than 0.5% or less on a CD, right? I mean, that just doesn't even make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
Anyway, so our topic for today is going to be the condo reform and how this is going to impact some buildings here in this area and all over Florida. And I think you'll appreciate having Leo's input on this because it's very much so his area of expertise. So it was right about a year ago, just a little over a year ago, that the Surfside condos actually collapsed. And that's when Ron DeSantis passed the Senate Bill 4D. And again, 98 people died in that condo collapse. So this is why they felt the need to hurry up and pass this.
It was actually interesting. The bill passed on the exact 1 year anniversary of the collapse. So
I think it was strategic, for sure.
Well, they were pressured to get something in place before a year elapsed, and they got to the deadline. And I think it was like, what was it, June that it happened? Because it went into effect in July. It went into effect July 1, so I'll have to look up on the break when it passed.
It was late June or early. I think it was early July, I want to say.
No, July 1 is when the bill goes into effect. All the new bills went into effect July 1.
But they would have had to sign it before that to go into effect July 1.
And it was signed on the 1 year
June.
anniversary.
I think it was June.
I believe so.
Anyway, So this whole reform, the Senate Bill 4D, passed because they want to make condos and buildings more safe. And some of these were built a very long time ago. We're going to talk about what some of these regulations are, and then we're going to have Mr. George Root chime in on how this affects you as a board member for an HOA. There's some more liability coming down the chain there. And of course, we'll wrap up this show nicely towards the end, talking about the structural component of how this new Senate bill will impact Florida condos and buildings.
It's June 24th.
There you go. This is Tampa Home Talk, 813-377-2775. We'll be right back.
Welcome home. This is Leo Kane with Beryl Engineering and Inspection, reminding you that 813-377-2775, that's 813-377-2775, is the only number you need to text.
It's our off-air number. And I do get complaints from listeners saying that we don't give it out enough.
We did.
So let's give it out one more time.
813-377-2775. It's very important to pause when you're given the last four numbers.
Yeah, and you can call or text us because that's our off-air number. So
It is off-air.
All right, so joining us this morning, Mr. George Root with Stockholm Law Group. Good morning.
Good morning. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So we were talking all about the Senate Bill 4D that passed after 98 people died in the Surfside condo collapse. And some of the bullet points just to run through, and then I'd love to have you chime in on this. What their plan is basically stricter inspections and rules for buildings that are 3 stories or higher. It's requiring building recertification after 30 years or 25 years if it's within 3 miles of the coast. If the building CO or certificate of occupancy was issued before or on July 1st, 1992, the building's initial milestone structural inspection must be performed before December 31st, 2024. And it also requires condo associations to have ample reserve funding for repairs and maintenance. It wants increased transparency for prospective buyers and renters in the properties. And there's a structural review in place at the time of the collapse. So 1.5 million condos statewide are 100 of them are over 30 years old. And so we'll talk more about every 10 years, the milestone and the structural inspections and all of that stuff with Leo a little bit later. George, I would love to hear from your perspective because you represent a lot of HOAs and you're very familiar with this area of law. What are you seeing in your world as it relates to advising condos and HOAs? And are you having any condos that are going to be impacted by this new law?
Absolutely. I have quite a few condos that are within 3 miles of the coast. And when the Joint Task Force got together after Surfside and the real property section of the Florida Bar made a lot of recommendations, and the changes they made with 4D this year are needed, and some of the things that we pushed for, but I think it still needs to go further, and I think you'll continue to see this legislation evolve over the years, and will continue to do more. Before they passed this legislation, the only 2 counties that had any building recertification process was Broward and Dade. The rest of the state didn't have it. So I'm glad that we have this initial milestone legislation now. I've got a couple of clients I've had in the past that are drastically underfunded for their reserve components, and this kind of forces their hands a little bit more and makes them do the right thing. I think even the most well-intentioned board members face an incredible amount of pressure from their members, from their constituents to, not raise assessments in economic times. And the folks in Surfside were facing, almost an impossible situation in that they were asked to pass special assessments, probably in excess of $100,000, and not too many people are,
prepared to write that check. Yeah,
they can absorb that, right?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing is you said that's the only 2 counties where there was already some type of building inspection in place, but ironically that's exactly where this happened. And before this whole thing collapsed, I think they had already done a structural inspection, didn't they, Leo, on it? And they were looking at trying to make the situation better?
Yeah, so I mean, the problems at Surfside, they originated from the construction of the building, and I can go in way too much engineering depth about that. But the building was the typical multiple contractors, cost overruns. They wanted to add a story to the building. They didn't change the plans. I mean,
that adds a lot of load. And weight.
yeah. So I mean, if you look at where the building failed, it failed right between the junction point between the old construction and the new construction. So, I mean, there's a lot of good science there. So it was failing from the get-go, and it was quite obvious for years that there was problems underneath the pool at the garage. I mean, you had planters with plants that instead of having, like, I often talk about this, if you got that 100-year-old home and you renovate the kitchen and you put a granite countertop in, you better put a pier underneath the new granite countertop. Well, they had planters with huge trees planted in them and dirt, and they didn't have anything underneath those planters to support.
So that's a lot of weight.
That's a lot of weight. That's more than a granite countertop. So, I mean, the problems at Surfside were prevalent. They were known. I mean, there was spalling rebar, and that's where the concrete is actually eroded to the point where you can see the rebar. There was massive dips, massive settlement damage. So it comes down to a combination of no one did anything and no one knew what to do.
Well, like George said, I think the challenge is, that these people that were on the board, like you said, George, were facing special assessments of $100,000, to repair this condo, and it's significant. Right?
Here's where I go, and sorry for doing that on radio. What I'm seeing now is Florida Statute 718, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I just said Florida Statute 718, but there's a lawyer on the call.
He'll chime in, let you know.
Florida Statute 718 basically said condominium associations needed to have a reserve study, but there was no teeth and no accountability in that piece of Florida Statute 718. Am I right, George?
Well, I think 4D takes care of all the reserve study issues.
Well, adds teeth.
Probably needs to, yeah, it certainly needs to go further. I mean, some of the language says that you need to complete the structural integrity reserve study every 10 years, which is probably not often enough, especially with the cost of inflation, to make sure that you're fully funding your reserves. And for those that don't know, the reserve studies are based upon a formula between the useful life of a reserve component and the replacement costs. And if you're only doing one of those every 10 years, how are you going to have an actual replacement cost that's accurate? I know just in the last few years, folks have had to drastically change their reserve formula because the cost of materials and the work to be done is going up every couple of months. 10 years is not often enough.
Yeah, we don't know where that's going to shake out on the wash, but I definitely feel like it's here to stay. A lot of these price increases, I mean...
Well, gas is under $4 a gallon, finally.
Well, I mean, the minimum wage is higher, the cost to get everything is higher, and the cost of the employees to assemble, make, or work in whatever business is higher. So all of those things are going to affect the cost of goods and services. So like George said, you can do a study today, but it may not be relevant in 10 years from now.
And that's the underlying issue with raising the minimum wage. If you raise the floor, it just gives everyone else an excuse to raise everything above it.
Right.
And a lot of times the people fighting to get minimum wage raised are the unions that are wanting their mid-level people to get raises. They're not fighting for the low-level people. But what ends up happening is when you raise minimum wage, you eliminate jobs and you also promote inflation.
Yeah, and with this day and age of computers and technology, I would imagine more and more jobs are replaced by either a technological component or somewhere overseas. It's just a matter of time, right? People are going to merge and they'll put maybe two jobs into one. We haven't seen a whole lot of that yet, but I think it's coming.
No, we've seen it in the grocery store. I mean, one cashier now can man 6 to 8 cashless.
Of the self, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so we've already seen it. And it's just going to get worse each year for the lower positions, the lower unskilled positions.
Absolutely. And it impacts everything, right? From the grocery store on up to these major buildings that need millions of dollars to make them where they should be, to have them safe. My question for you is, George, I want to make sure we cover this one question, and then by all means, you can share anything you feel necessary. What about in terms of like HOA liability? And I wish Adam was here for this one too, to chime in on it. But what are you seeing in terms of like the liability? Because what I was told is that like using Surfside Surfside, for example, the board of directors, they're suing those people personally.
Normally, a director is protected by the business judgment rule, and they have to exercise the care of an ordinarily prudent person, which isn't a terribly high threshold, and there's some protections for board members. One piece of this legislation provides that any willful and knowing failure by an officer or director to have a milestone inspection conducted or performed is considered a breach of their fiduciary duty and opens up to some liability, and definitely the business judgment rule and the other protections built into 617, which is the not-for-profit corporation statute, 718, don't shield them from liability when they have these willful and knowing failures to do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, it definitely takes on a little bit more liability to the officers, and you can't use the excuse that you didn't know. I think there should be some type of a required education class when you're going to serve somewhere on the HOA or in a board of directors.
I teach those.
Do you?
I teach those for free, so
it should be required.
I don't hear anybody needing one.
Yeah, I mean, the scary part about most board members is it's a volunteer position, but you're running a corporation, and some of these are multi-million-dollar corporations.
Yeah, definitely. All right, George, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more on the Senate Bill 4D. We're going to talk about some things you should know as a homeowner, and especially maybe a condo owner in an older building that has to have one of these reserve studies, because as a real estate agent, I think it's going to impact your property value. We'll chat about that when we come back. 813-377-2775. You can call or text us and we'll get your questions answered. 813-377-2775. Again, off-air number for Katrina Madewell or any of our guests here on Tampa Home Talk, 813-377-2775. We'll be right back. All right, welcome home. This is Tampa Home Talk, and I'm your host, Katrina Madewell, hanging out with one of my favorite sidekicks, Mr. Leo King with Beryl.
I think I am your favorite sidekick.
Yeah, you probably are.
Thank you.
First and the last and the only, right? No. Maybe Pat George, yes. No one could replace
Pat, there's
you.
a button you're supposed to push when you do that. It's supposed to, dump your cough out of the segment.
And
Mr. How that works for you today.
Mr. George Root with Stockholm Law Group, the HOA expert extraordinaire. Thank you again for joining us back. And I guess a good place to pick up from where we left off, and either of you gentlemen, please chime in because this is not my area of expertise. But let's talk about what a reserve study is exactly, how this is going to impact the condos, and anything else we should add to that.
Well, I often think that a reserve study, I take the CAI, which is the Condominium Association Institute's definition. It is a physical and financial tool for your condominium or homeowner association, specifically for capital improvement projects. And I know I just vomited a whole bunch of fancy terms, but basically it's a spending plan for future spending on major repairs.
And an example of some of those things could be anything from the roads coming in to
Typically what we see is roofs, windows, painting, stucco, driveways. Those are the big components. Littler components would be like a pool, spa, the pool deck, fencing, retaining walls, seawalls. Basically, big dollar stuff that you need to start. And what I really like, if you fully understand what a reserve study is, you should have something in similar if you're a homeowner in a random house. That way, when your $7,500 roof replacement comes up, if you've been saving money and setting money aside into a separate bank account for repairs to your house, that's kind of what a reserve study is. So I recommend taking that methodology and using it even if you are just a normal homeowner. And this is your Leo Kane tip of the week.
Well, the reserve study gives you an idea of what is going to need to be replaced and by when.
Right.
So you can budget and plan for that accordingly.
And the whole purpose behind the reserve study is to avoid a special assessment. You were going to add to that, George?
Yes, with the condo statute, it basically mandates that any component over $10K has to be a mandatory statutory reserve category that you're reserving for. And I don't know about you, but I've never had a condominium client that had any component that could be replaced for less than 10K. So virtually everything that's not routine maintenance that requires replacement at some point needs to be reserved for, and that's mandated by statute, and you have to fully fund it. Whereas in HOA world, it's a different animal. You don't have shared party walls and as many common elements, so the reserve components are only, or the reserve, statutory reserve items are only established by membership vote, whereas the Florida statute in 718 requires condos to have these mandatory reserve categories.
And so how are you seeing that show up right now? And I imagine you guys have been retained by several condos and associations to make sure that they're protected from all these changes, right?
Definitely post-Surfside, I'm having an easier time convincing clients to do the right thing and fully fund reserves and make sure they meet their obligations. Previously it was far too easy to less than fully fund. You just needed a majority membership vote, and I'm not sure whether 4D addresses that, but if it does not, I think one of the other changes you will see in the future is making it harder and harder for boards and their members to opt out of fully funding reserves.
Yeah, I don't remember reading anything about the funding of reserves. It was more about the study adding the components to it. I really don't think they addressed the funding or the partial funding in that.
I mean, the reserves make the larger special assessments later a lot less, if at all. But, I mean,
that's the hope.
Yeah, we're talking about the basic funding for some of these things that should be done where there is no reserve.
Yeah, I mean, what I found scary right now is because we do reserve studies, and we do quite a few of them, the amount of associations that are meeting the criteria of being 25 years or older within 3 miles of the water, the amount of associations that have never had reserve studies that are coming to us. And I would say 95% of the time we do a reserve study on an HOA that has not had a formal reserve study done, they are always underfunded.
Oh, I bet. That's going to go over like, you know what?
Yeah, I mean, it's like...
when they mention the homeowners that we've got to tag all these special assessments.
Well, there's no special assessments. All you do is you raise your dues. You raise your dues and you raise your reserves.
Depending on how urgent some of those
things
are.
If the construction needs to happen, then... See, that's where... This is a financial tool moving forward. So, I mean, if you have a $2 million roof replacement coming up and you do a reserve study saying it's going to cost $2 million, that's not going to cause a special assessment.
Right.
The fact that you hadn't been saving 15 years and you've been underfunding that line item, that's what's going to cause the special assessment.
It's interesting. There's some caps on year-to-year increases in the condominium statute on regular assessments, and it's not necessarily a hard cap. It's 115%, and it basically triggers membership ability to challenge that budget and propose an alternate budget. But what's also interesting is any amounts that you have to increase your regular assessments to fully fund reserves don't count towards the calculation of that 115%. So, and most of the time your governing documents allow the board to adopt budgets. So there's a number of ways to meet the funding requirements without having to go get an onerous membership vote to do the right thing.
Yeah, it's I think we're going to see a lot of changes for sure as it relates not only to values, but I think some of these laws may actually bump into each other, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's going to be some, aside from just protecting the structural integrity of buildings, I think you will see in first-party claims and that kind of thing, which the rest of my firm does, that as they're doing these reserve studies, as they're doing better maintenance, you will have a record of the condition of the property, and you're going to have an easier time, I think, recovering claims in the event of a hurricane or other things because you're doing this routine maintenance. You can easily show that these things that were damaged in an event weren't damaged before because you're doing the structural inspections and you're fully documenting the condition of your property.
Yeah, so what this says is that every 10 years there's a milestone structural inspection to be performed by a licensed architect or engineer, aka someone like Beryl, does a lot of structural engineering. The phase 1 milestone inspection requires just a visual inspection of the building, including the major structural components, and you have to provide a qualitative assessment on the structural condition of the building. So what does this look like, Leo? Have you done any of these phase 1 visual inspections yet?
We've done the equivalent of a phase 1 visual inspection on a regular basis. Now, this is just basically what ends up happening now is it's formal. So in the past, we would do one of these assessments and we turn it over to the board. The requirement now is we got to send a copy to the building department. None of the building departments we've talked to know what they're going to do with them, how they're going to record them, and how they're going to track them.
This is going to be interesting.
That's where I think 4D loses its teeth, in that it's a state bill that puts the accountability on the county and city level, who are already understaffed, and they don't know what to do with these. So are the county and cities supposed to, and this question for George, are they supposed to make a list of the properties that are eligible and then start checking off on the list on what they get and when they get it by? I mean, how are you seeing the building departments locally here?
I can't speak for this area, but I do have a couple of condo clients in Broward County where they've had this type of rule in effect on a local level for many years, and I usually get letters. My clients will get letters to the registered agent saying, "Hey, you're nearing the inspection deadline. You need to get us this information by X date," and then they pursue the association. I don't know. Most of mine comply, so I don't get to the enforcement side of it where they haven't complied yet. But I think you will see some changes to this bill, to this legislation in the future to kind of address the enforcement teeth a little bit more.
So a question for you, Leo. When you go out there and you're doing one of these phase 1 visual inspections, what kind of things are you looking for? And I always love to make this show about the layperson and things that people that are living in a condo might notice, right? That could have them make a more informed decision on what they want to do and when they want to do it. So what kind of visual things are you looking for that someone could look for on their own? I
mean, it's visual observation. It's visual observable defects. So, I mean, we're looking at the balconies and railings. I mean, you look down at your balconies and your railings. Can you see cracks? Can you shake them? If you shake them, do they move off the wall? I mean, it's general safety stuff. If you're walking, like in Surfside, for instance, people were parking in the garage and walking to their house, and they could see the dip in the ceiling. They could see the rusted rebar starting to come down. They could see tree roots coming through the planters into the garage area. These are some pretty obvious defects.
Deal,
yeah, these are pretty obvious things that we're looking for. So it's not until you get to the phase 2 testing that we start tearing stuff out to try and really figure out how bad the damage is. So, I mean, and again, I say this on everything, and I've said this before when Surfside happened last year, and I said this when Lake Pragen happened with the sinkhole that swallowed up a whole subdivision. No structural issues happen overnight. They take a long time to develop. In Surfside's case, it took 30 plus years for it to collapse. And even if you look at the collapse itself, it took 7 minutes for the building to collapse.
Was that building 30 years old?
It was over 30 years old.
7 minutes. Wow.
It took us 7 full minutes from the time that you heard the first in pop or the shattering and the building started shaking. You had 7 minutes before it crumbled to the ground. And that's actually how less people died than you would think, is because it took so long during that process for the building to fully collapse.
You had 7 minutes to get out.
Yeah, well, if you knew what was going on. Also, only 2/3 of the tower collapsed, and it was Snowbird Tower. So, I mean, there was a lot of positive things about a very negative event that prevented the loss of more life. You just have to realize that even in that catastrophic collapse point in time, it still wasn't instant. It took 7 minutes from the first warning signs of this building's going to fall to the 15-second clip we all see from the bank CTV across the street.
Well, it was no different than the sinkhole in Lake Pageant. I mean, that started, in doing a lot of research all the way back to the developers, right?
Yeah.
That filled in areas they shouldn't have. And
the sinkhole claim they made in 2007 that they didn't do the proper repair on.
Yeah.
I mean, there was 10 years after you knew there was a major sinkhole happening, you didn't do anything, and It collapsed.
Finally, 10 years later. But
Yeah, so I stress that over and over again. Structural collapse does not happen instantly without any warning signs.
well, it's like with anything, right? Major, it's usually gradually and then suddenly.
Yeah, I use the rubber band example, for example, and I'll talk more about the rubber band example when we come back from break. 813-377-2775. If you live in a condominium and you need a structural reserve study or a milestone inspection, 813-377-2775.
And we'll be back right after this break. So stick around. Mr. George Root hopefully will be hanging with us. I know he's got a meeting to get to in 15 minutes.
A
But
Zoomer.
we'll chat more about this when we come back. Stick around. This is Tampa Home Talk.
Welcome home, Tampa Home Talk, rounding out the top of the 9 o'clock hour with your news update.
Oh, this is going to be your favorite part of the show.
What do you mean? This whole show has been my favorite part of the show.
Talking about the structural part of these phase 2 inspections. And so some of the requirements, I can read in part of this and let you do your thing.
I don't even need to read this. I feel like I wrote this outline.
You probably very closely did. But so this phase 2 of the milestone inspection to be performed, it's an extensive or as limited necessary to fully assess the areas of structural distress in order to confirm that the building is structurally sound and safe for its intended use, and to recommend a program for fully assessing and repairing distresses and damaging portions of the building. So upon completion of phase 1 and phase 2, the inspection professional must submit a sealed copy of the inspection report with a summary, findings, and recommendations for repairs to the association, local building official, as you mentioned, with the correct jurisdiction. And the association is also required to distribute the summary to each unit owner. That's the transparency part they were talking about, and post a copy of the summary in the conspicuous place on the property. So such repairs must be commenced within 365 days after receiving the phase 2 inspection report, and the association must provide local enforcement agency with proof that these repairs have been done, scheduled, and commenced. If the association fails to provide, the local enforcement agency must review and determine if the building is unsafe for human occupancy. So this is one of those
There's a lot of text there that's really simply explained.
We're going to see like this start to change like a year later. It's going to look very different than it does now.
I mean, okay, so you do your phase 1 inspection, which is a visual. Let's go back to my balcony example. You saw the balcony railing separating from the side of the wall.
Speaking of which, I saw a really freaking scary one in Carrollwood, like literally about, I don't know, a couple months ago. And the guy was selling. I was like, I wouldn't
lean up against that. Yeah, I wouldn't lean up against that.
And this was before all this happened.
So let's say you got one of those balcony and there's some cracks at the base. Phase 1. Okay, we're to say, hey, we need more investigation here. This is a structural defect. Phase 2, this is a real scenario. We're going to see that there's carpeting next to the cement, next to the balcony. So now we're on the inside of your unit. We're going to tear up the carpeting. We're going to pull it back. And in this scenario, concrete, like you know how you glue down a carpet pad? Well, on this one, cement was stuck because the cement was falling up and it was flaking off. And we could see the rusted rebar underneath. So that would be the phase 2 piece. We're doing the investigation to see what needs to be done. So now we've got a bigger issue where you thought it was just the railings. In actuality, that whole balcony piece was ready to fall. So what's the fix on something like that? You got to put out emergency shoring. You've got to basically remove and replace the whole balcony. It's not just the railings. So I mean that's a real world example of this phase 1, phase 2. Where I think it's overly confusing here is it's like, well, the authority having jurisdiction, your building department, needs to be aware of all this. Well, of course they will. You can't do this work without a permit.
But how are they going to... Here's the problem that I see is a lot of these municipalities have people working for them that may not be the top of the top in their trade, right?
No, the problem here is the state has dumped the enforcement on the building departments without giving them any guidance as to what to do. And I had worked for a building department back in the early 2000s.
But they also need the right people to be able to advise on what's okay and what isn't.
No, they have people that think they know what they're doing. Every building department has. I mean, they're going to get. It's simple. I mean, the building department will get a report saying these are the repairs that are needed. They will then get permit documents for like design plans. They'll compare the two to see if it's, one, meeting the scope of the first document, and two, does it meet Florida Building Code? I mean, that's the easy part. It's just how do they keep track of it? How do they know this needs to be done? I mean, that's the part that's confusing to the building departments right now.
They're going to have to put a whole plan in place.
Mm-hmm. And they're scrambling.
To comply. I bet.
And they're scrambling because they're, like I said, they're understaffed. So now this is one more thing the state has dumped on them to keep track of.
Well,
and they're stressing the
require
boards.
more people. This is not possible to do it without more people.
Oh, we would hope.
Yeah, I don't know how they would do it.
Let's get a building department on here and ask them.
They're already begging the municipalities and people that are building to go private provider because they can't keep up.
No, the state is put laws in effect to force the building departments to go down that route. The building departments don't want to go that route. I can talk about several building departments in our local area that fight on a regular basis the private provider because they think they're being robbed fees. So the building departments don't like the private provider.
But they can't keep up with the demand. And with these new layers of condos, that's going to be worse.
They're not allowed to add more people. So they're in a situation where they can't add more people. And if they do all this private provider stuff, they feel like they're losing money. So, I mean, it's a vicious cycle.
I think like I said, 365 days repairs have to be commenced. So this is going to look very different in 12 to 14 months than it does right now. And like George was saying, some of these laws are bumping into each other.
They will. I mean, you can be like 6 to 8 months of investigation, and then you have to get a set of plans approved through the building department. That could take another 6 months, so you're over the deadline. I mean, there's so many things that are in conflict right now. This was a good start. This was something that was needed. I always go back to Florida condominiums needed to have reserve studies every 5 years, but there was no accountability and there was no enforcement. This is added accountability and enforcement. It's not the best way to do accountability and enforcement, but it's a step in that direction. So I think this is a step definitely in the right direction. But as a condo owner, if you are one that does not have a formal reserve studies, your condo dues for reserves could double or triple. They're just throwing that out there. That's the end result. Like the takeaway, if you were in a condo association,
which is not impacted in that 110% that George was saying.
It was not. No,
because it's reserves.
Yeah, it's reserves. So if you are a condo association that did not have a formal reserve study done by a third-party company, and you are subject to this new criteria, you're probably looking at doubling or tripling your reserves on your next year's budget. If you were an association that was reserving, you're probably looking for 1 to 1.5 to maybe 2 times the reserves going up still because they're added components. There were things that you don't have to, like George mentioned earlier, windows were usually on the unit owner side. Well, now windows are on the HOA side.
You're still doing a lot of these inspections yourself, right, Leo, for this condo? So if you live in a condo, you're on the board, you definitely want to consider having Beryl Engineering and Inspections come do this for you. And you can reach out, just call or text us at 813-377-2775. We'll get you connected with Leo. 813-377-2775. And this is Tampa Home Talk. We'll be back with another exciting show next week. And remember, love where you live, or we're going to fix it. Welcome home.
Love where you live.